The winter of 1822 hung heavy over Charleston County, draping the Ravencraftoff plantation in a blanket of frost and silence. The estate, once the pride of South Carolina's planter elite, now seemed to brood under a shadow that no candle or hearthfire could pierce. The wind whispered through the gnarled oaks, carrying secrets that even the oldest workers feared to speak aloud. It had been weeks since the Kane family vanished, and yet the plantation felt as though their absence had carved a hollow in every corner. The enslaved quarters were tense, a tightrope of quiet watchfulness stretched between despair and fear. No one dared speak openly of what had occurred, for those who remembered too much often vanished first. Cordelia Ravencraftoff, the young mistress of the house, had always been a woman of unusual intellect and charm. But beneath her genteel exterior lay a curiosity so cold and systematic it would come to haunt the very foundation of the plantation. Rumors among the servants hinted at experiments meant to break the human spirit. At first, these whispers seemed impossible, the sort of thing one would only tell in the dark after lights were snuffed and the night felt long. Yet traces of what she had done began surfacing, small but damning. A ledger here, a tool there, all meticulously organized as if awaiting someone to uncover them. The winter's bite was nothing compared to the chill of discovery that would soon grip the estate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows thickened against the walls of the great house, faint cries and movements were heard near the old Kane quarters. No one dared investigate alone. The air itself seemed heavy with anticipation, as though the land remembered the suffering that had occurred upon it. As the night grew colder, a shadow passed among the servants. Eyes wide, breaths shallow, they whispered of patterns and notes left behind by the Kane family, signs that someone had resisted, survived, and perhaps even plotted revenge. The first clues of systematic cruelty began to emerge. A ledger detailing punishments so precise they resembled experiments more than discipline. Diagrams of rooms and implements, names of those who had enforced the methods. Before the darkness swallowed the estate completely, one young maid, trembling and clutching a candle, dared to speak. This isn't just punishment," she murmured. "They were testing us, testing what fear could do." Her voice faltered, caught by the cold wind, as if the night itself demanded silence. And in that silence, a question lingered. What had the Kane family discovered, and could their knowledge still unsettle those who thought themselves untouchable? If you're watching this story and want to uncover the secrets of the Ravencraftoff plantation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Every place has its own shadows, and tonight you're stepping into ours. The frost continued to settle over the estate, and somewhere in the darkness, the first flicker of resistance moved unseen, waiting for the right moment to strike. The first light of dawn in Charleston County crept across the frost-laden fields of the Ravencraftoff plantation like an unwelcome witness. Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraftoff awoke to a silence that felt heavier than any winter storm he had ever endured. In the past, the estate's sprawling grounds had been alive with the rhythmic sounds of labor, the creak of oxen-drawn carts, the hammering of blacksmiths, the low murmur of workers moving through the fields. But now, even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if anticipating the horror it was about to carry. Colonel Ravencraftoff had been in the Grand Hall, poring over correspondence that detailed the plantation's ongoing operations. It was then that a faint sound, almost imperceptible above the crackling of the fireplace, caught his attention. A servant, pale and trembling, stumbled into the room, eyes wide, hand pressed to her mouth. "Sir," she gasped. "In the East Wing, ma'am." "Mrs. Cordelia?" Ravencraftoff's pulse quickened. The East Wing had always been the mistress's domain, elegantly appointed rooms, libraries lined with volumes from London and Paris, and unknown to most, a secluded area where Cordelia conducted her private experiments. He rushed toward the wing, the chill in the corridors gnawing at him like the cold bite of a predator. When he arrived, the sight froze him in place. Cordelia's body lay unnaturally still on the floor, her hands splayed, eyes wide open as though witnessing her final moment of terror. It was not the work of a sudden illness or accident. Her expression spoke of fear, calculation, and shock. Around her were the remnants of meticulously arranged instruments, notebooks, and papers, everything Cordelia had employed in her secret program. Ravencraftoff staggered backward. He could not, would not, allow this discovery to become public knowledge. The implications were too vast. Cordelia's work had not been mere cruelty, it had been systematic, deliberate, and documented. The potential scandal threatened not only his own name but the standing of every prominent planter who might have been associated with Cordelia's experimental methods. Within hours, he had dispatched riders to contact the most trusted members of South Carolina's planter elite. Each messenger carried urgent instructions: arrive immediately, bring discretion, and prepare for coordinated action. By evening, representatives from several of the most influential families had arrived at Ravenscraft, their expressions carefully controlled masks of concern. Behind the polite exchanges and veiled sympathy, each mind raced. The estate's secret program must not see the light of day. The discovery of Cordelia's body ignited a crisis that demanded swift, decisive action. What these men faced was evidence so damning that conventional methods of concealment, quiet disposal of records, casual explanations, the occasional rumor, would prove wholly inadequate. The Kane family's detailed documentation and the systematic nature of the experiments meant that anyone who knew the truth could unravel decades of perceived honor and influence. A plan was quickly devised, what Ravenscraft and his allies would later call comprehensive suppression. It would require coordination across local law enforcement, regional newspapers, and even political authorities at the state level. The official story had to be believable. Cordelia's death would be presented as the tragic outcome of a sudden slave rebellion, swiftly quelled and contained. But the actual scale of her experimental program posed a far greater threat. Every witness, every ledger, every instrument of torture would have to vanish. The two overseers who had been killed, those who had enforced Cordelia's cruel methodologies, were carefully described in official accounts as victims of unprovoked violence. No mention could be made of their roles in the experimental program, for to do so would implicate others in a network of orchestrated terror. The Kane family, 7 souls whose resilience had already disrupted the plantation's order, were reported as captured and executed, though in reality no public executions had taken place and no bodies were ever produced. The remote building where the experiments had been conducted was systematically dismantled. Lumber and metal were burned and scattered, ensuring that no physical evidence remained to betray the truth. Most dangerous of all was the comprehensive written record left by the Kane family. Multiple copies had been prepared, and the task of locating each one demanded extraordinary coordination, crossing state lines and involving individuals whose own reputations now depended on secrecy. Yet even as the conspirators moved to bury the evidence, none anticipated the effect their actions would have on rumor and speculation. The very thoroughness of the cover-up, the sudden disappearances, the dismantled buildings, the gaps in official records, would spark whispers that would echo far beyond Charleston County. The story of the Ravenscraft plantation would not die, it would metamorphose into legend, spoken of in hushed tones among enslaved workers, abolitionist circles, and even neighboring planters who feared exposure. As the days passed, the strain on Ravenscraft became evident. Banks that had once competed for his business began calling in loans, merchants demanded immediate payment, and social invitations vanished as though he had ceased to exist. The pressure was compounded by the subtler threat, the enslaved population itself. News of the Kane family's courage and knowledge spread, creating a dangerous energy among those who had previously submitted quietly to their masters. Even Martha Washington, the elderly cook whose quiet prayers had become the heartbeat of the community, had evolved her role. She now maintained a covert network, documenting the fate of the Kane family and coordinating the flow of information across plantations. This intelligence, unknown to Ravenscraft and his allies, was fostering organized resistance that stretched beyond the boundaries of any single estate. By mid-February, the full extent of Cordelia's program began to emerge, not to the public, but to those who had dared to investigate her records and instruments before they could be destroyed. It was horrifying in its meticulous precision. Punishments scheduled and recorded, instruments crafted for maximum psychological impact, experimental variations meant to gauge responses to fear and deprivation. It was not chaos, it was science. And in that very revelation lay the seed of rebellion. The Kane family had not merely endured, they had understood. They had studied the patterns of oppression and learned to exploit them. For every method designed to break the human spirit, they had discovered a weakness to be turned back against their oppressors. Colonel Ravenscraft, once confident in the authority of his name and lineage, found himself trapped in the enormity of the situation. The very documents he had sought to suppress now seemed to take on a life of their own, whispering of resistance, of knowledge passed from one hand to another, of networks no official could anticipate. The walls of his mansion, once symbols of control, now echoed with the unspoken threat of vengeance, mechanical, deliberate, unstoppable. And then, a single message arrived and signed in a careful hand. a description of events so precise that it could only have come from someone intimately familiar with both the estate and the cover-up. It included details no outsider could know, the layout of the experimental building, the instruments used, and even phrases from correspondence that indicated other planters had been complicit. Ravencraftoft read it, hand-trembling, heart-pounding. Whoever had written this knew everything. The message concluded not with a threat, but with a promise. That knowledge was power, and that power was now shifting. At that moment, a servant appeared at the doorway, whispering that another rider had arrived from a neighboring estate, bringing news that more of Cordelia's methods had been replicated elsewhere, and that the Kane family's influence might extend far beyond the boundaries of Charleston County. Colonel Ravencraftoft felt the room spin. Panic, for the first time in his life, had taken hold. The foundations of his family's reputation, his financial security, and the control of the enslaved population were all crumbling. And somewhere beyond the walls of the plantation, the Kane family was watching, planning, and moving in ways that no one yet understood. If you're following this story and want to stay ahead of the secrets of the Ravencraftoft plantation, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, because every corner of the world has its own shadows, and tonight you're stepping into ours. The dawn broke, pale and cold, over Charleston County. But as the sun rose, it revealed not hope, but the beginning of a far-reaching nightmare, one that would test the limits of control, courage, and human endurance. The question lingered in every mind: just how far had Cordelia's experiments reached, and what would the Kane family do next? By the time night fell over the Ravencraftoft plantation, the air had grown thick with unease, carrying the scent of fear and smoke. The remnants of Cordelia's experimental building, once a secluded fortress of cruelty, were reduced to smoldering ruins. Wood, metal, and glass had been burned, scattered, and buried under layers of ash, leaving only scorched earth as a mute testament to the horrors that had occurred there. Every trace of the experiments had to disappear, every ledger, every instrument, every whisper of evidence. Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraftoft moved through the charred remains with careful steps, surveying the work of hired laborers who had been brought in under the strictest secrecy. The overseers, loyal men whose silence could be purchased with the right combination of gold and threats, ensured that no one spoke to outsiders. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their torches flickering against the skeletal trees, casting long, sinister shadows across the fields. The colonel felt the weight of the night pressing down on him, an almost physical force that reminded him of how fragile his control had become. Every detail of Cordelia's program had been carefully documented by the Kane family, and now the destruction of the building was only the first step in what would become a massive, coordinated effort to bury the truth. Letters, journals, and sketches were hunted down and seized, every page examined, shredded, or burned. Even the faintest trace of Cordelia's cruel methods had to be obliterated. The colonel knew that the consequences of failure were unimaginable. If the network of planters, overseers, and freedmen learned that any record had survived, the scandal would spread like wildfire. In the parlor of the main house, Ravencraftoft convened his closest allies, men of prominence whose families had stakes in maintaining appearances. They spoke in hushed tones, the candlelight casting flickering shadows across faces etched with worry. Each understood the stakes. The destruction of Cordelia's legacy would require more than fire and secrecy. It would require deception, coercion, and the careful orchestration of public perception. The first measure was bribery. Local sheriffs, easily swayed by promises of gold or the assurance of political protection, were given clear instructions to report any inquiries as baseless rumors. Judges and magistrates, already wary of losing their own influence, were reminded of favors owed and the consequences of defiance. Through carefully administered payments and threats, every official who might obstruct the cover-up was rendered compliant. Next came intimidation. Anyone who had witnessed the events in the East Wing, or who had even hinted at Cordelia's experiments, received warnings. Some were threatened with imprisonment, others with loss of property or livelihood. For the enslaved population, a few select individuals were made examples. Publicly punished for minor infractions, their suffering amplified as a grim reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Fear, the colonel and his peers knew, could silence more effectively than loyalty ever could. Yet the task was delicate. Too much brutality would spark questions, too little and the truth could slip through cracks. Ravencraftoft carefully balanced the execution of each measure. The public narrative was meticulously constructed. Cordelia had been killed during a sudden, violent slave rebellion that had been swiftly suppressed. The two overseers who had died were presented as innocent bystanders, victims of the chaos. The 7 members of the Kane family were said to have been captured and executed, though no bodies were ever shown. The story, once polished, was frighteningly believable, bolstered by a plantation that had always appeared disciplined and orderly to outside observers. Despite these efforts, Ravenscraft felt a gnawing sense of unease. He had underestimated the reach of Cordelia's influence and the sophistication of the Kane family. For even as his allies moved to control the narrative, the enslaved population whispered of survival, of escape, and of the mysterious ability of the Kane family to vanish without a trace. The rumors spread quietly but persistently, like smoke curling through the cracks of a tightly sealed room. Martha Washington, the elderly cook whose quiet wisdom had always been underestimated, proved to be the Colonel's silent adversary. She had long maintained the prayer circles that brought hope and resilience to the enslaved population, but her role had evolved. In the shadows, she documented the Colonel's efforts, noting every missing ledger, every overseer reassignment, every bribe paid. Her intelligence network now extended across neighboring plantations, linking enslaved and freed black individuals who had long understood that survival required both secrecy and cunning. As the days turned into weeks, Ravenscraft's control began to fray. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and order, felt smaller and more confined, as if the very walls conspired against him. He moved from room to room, overseeing the destruction of evidence, checking on guards, reviewing every communication with allies. But each task completed only served to remind him of what had been lost: the trust of his community, the loyalty of his workers, and the untouchable reputation he had once enjoyed. One evening, as a winter wind rattled the shutters, a messenger arrived with urgent news. And signed letters had begun appearing in abolitionist newspapers across the North. Each contained detailed accounts of Cordelia's experimental program, far more sophisticated than any rumor could convey. The descriptions were precise, citing instruments, locations, and even phrases lifted directly from correspondence among the plantation elite. Ravenscraft read the letters with a mounting sense of horror. They revealed that the Kane family had not only survived but had established networks capable of transmitting intelligence beyond Charleston County. They had documented weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and patterns in the operations of southern plantations, a level of insight that could undermine the entire system. Every shred of secrecy, every act of intimidation and bribery had been anticipated. The letters proved that knowledge, once spread, could not be contained. For the Colonel, the implications were terrifying. The cover-up, elaborate and ruthless as it had been, was already failing. Across the South, whispers of rebellion and sabotage began to circulate among the planter elite. Crops failed inexplicably, overseers disappeared, and equipment broke down under circumstances that suggested deliberate interference. It was no longer a question of isolated incidents. The Kane family's influence had grown into something far more dangerous, a coordinated, strategic threat that no single plantation could withstand. The letters ended not with signatures but with subtle warnings. Knowledge was power, they implied, and the balance of power was shifting. For Ravenscraft, the words carried the weight of prophecy. Even as he tightened his control, even as he spent gold and leveraged fear, he could not stop the unseen hand that had begun to dismantle his world piece by piece. And then the final blow, a message carried by a rider who refused to identify himself, arrived with the chilling note that more information would follow. It hinted that the Kane family had connections in northern cities, allies who could provide resources and sanctuary, and strategies that extended beyond the scope of Charleston County. For the Colonel, this was the beginning of a nightmare that had no apparent end. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields where once thriving cotton now lay trampled and burned, echoing the Colonel's growing realization: control was no longer his. Even as he tried to consolidate power, even as he tightened the plantation's security, the very system he had relied upon, fear, intimidation, wealth, was being turned against him. In the quiet of his study, Ravenscraft considered his next move. Should he attempt further suppression, risking exposure through desperation? Or accept that the Kane family had outmaneuvered him entirely, that the foundations of his power had been irrevocably shaken? Each option carried peril, and inaction seemed equally dangerous. Somewhere beyond the crumbling walls of the Ravenscraft estate, the Kane family moved with purpose, invisible yet omnipresent. Their plans were unknown, their reach formidable, and their intelligence network, nurtured by courage and cunning, now threatened the entire social and economic structure upon which southern plantations had relied for generations. And as night fell again over Charleston County, one question remained unanswered, a shadow lingering in the hearts of all who sought to maintain control. who would act first and who would survive the storm that had already begun. If you're following this story and want to see how the Kane family's resistance continues to unfold, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to leave your location in the comments. It's incredible to see how far this story has reached, connecting viewers across the world. The stage was set for a confrontation that no one yet understood, and the first inkling of the Kane family's plan was already arriving in unsigned letters appearing in abolitionist newspapers across the North, a harbinger of a revelation that would shake the foundations of the South. The first unsigned letter appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper, tucked discreetly between advertisements for dry goods and notices of ships arriving from Europe. At first glance, it seemed no different from the anonymous abolitionist tracts that circulated quietly in northern cities. But those who read closely realized it was unlike anything published before. This was not rhetoric, nor was it moral philosophy. It was an account, precise, detailed, methodical, of the experiments carried out on the Ravenscraft plantation. The letter described instruments of torment in language so clinical that some readers doubted its authenticity. But woven through its sentences were references so specific: the layout of Cordelia's East Wing, the descriptions of overseers by name, the coded marks in her ledgers, that it was clear this was no invention. Whoever had written it had been there. Within weeks, copies spread to Boston, New York, and beyond. Abolitionist leaders seized on the letters as proof of what they had long argued: that slavery was not merely an economic system but a deliberate machinery of cruelty. Meetings were convened, speeches delivered, pamphlets printed in the thousands. The name Ravenscraft became a symbol, whispered with equal parts horror and fascination. The Kane family, though unnamed, was implied in every line, a family that had resisted, observed, and recorded their tormentors with a cold precision that now threatened to unravel the South's greatest secret. Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft felt the weight of every word as though it had been carved into his own skin. Reports reached him daily of northern presses circulating the accounts. His allies among the planter elite convened again, this time in panic. Some argued for silence, insisting that attention would fade if the matter was ignored. Others demanded retaliation, harsher laws, tighter controls, even violence against those suspected of spreading the story. But all agreed on one thing: the Kane family had survived and their knowledge was spreading. The colonel's nights became sleepless vigils. He would sit in his study, staring at maps of his plantation, imagining escape routes, caches of documents, hidden correspondences he might have overlooked. Each sound in the night, a creak of the floorboards, the rattle of the shutters, set his nerves on edge. His power, once absolute, now felt porous. Even worse, evidence of sabotage began to emerge. Crops spoiled under suspicious circumstances, tools shattered without warning, fires broke out in barns with no clear cause. Overseers whispered that the enslaved population moved with a new confidence, speaking in hushed tones, meeting in hidden corners. Rumors spread of songs carrying coded messages, of prayers that doubled as plans. Ravenscraft attempted to crush these whispers with swift punishment, but the effect was the opposite. Each lash of the whip seemed to strengthen resolve rather than weaken it. Each body laid low became a martyr, a name added to the growing tapestry of resistance. He began to sense that he was not facing scattered defiance, but something organized, deliberate, and expanding. In Charleston, other planters complained of similar disturbances. A horse poisoned here, a warehouse burned there, slaves vanishing into the night despite patrols. At first, they blamed coincidence or the usual hazards of managing large estates. But when an overseer disappeared from a plantation miles away, vanished without trace, leaving only a broken rifle and a trail of footprints that led into the swamp, the whispers grew louder. The Kane family's influence, it seemed, was no longer confined to Ravenscraft. In the North, abolitionist leaders debated the authenticity of the letters. Some worried they were fabrications designed to inflame tensions. But then came a second set of documents, sketches of Cordelia's instruments, reproduced with uncanny accuracy. And a third, diary entries, detailing not just punishments but the cold reasoning behind them. The evidence was overwhelming. For the first time, Northerners could read in chilling detail what slavery looked like, not as rumor or metaphor, but as documented fact. The South responded with fury. Newspapers denounced the letters as Northern propaganda, insisting they were inventions designed to destroy the Southern way of life. Planters who had once whispered their support for Cordelia's methods now publicly condemned them, desperate to distance themselves from scandal. Yet in their private circles, the fear was palpable. If the Kane family could document and distribute their findings once, what else might they be capable of? Colonel Ravencroft grew increasingly isolated. Merchants withdrew credit. Allies avoided his letters. Even those who had once depended on him for leadership began to whisper that perhaps the Kane family had cursed him, that his house and name were marked for ruin. Late one night, as the colonel sat at his desk, another letter arrived. This one was not from the north but delivered directly to his estate, tucked under the door of his study. It was brief, written in a steady hand. "You cannot silence knowledge. We watched you burn her papers. We watched you bury her tools. We memorized everything. The truth lives in us and we are everywhere." There was no signature, only a mark, a small, precise cross, identical to the one Cordelia had used in her ledgers. Ravencroft's hand trembled as he read it. He had tightened his grip on his world, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. He thought of the Kane family, not broken, not scattered, but moving unseen through fields, forests, and swamps, carrying their knowledge like firebrands. He thought of the whispers in the north, the panic in the south, the overseers vanishing, the crops rotting. And for the first time, the colonel admitted what he had long denied. He was no longer in control. The storm had already begun. If you've been following this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Things are about to escalate. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. This story may be rooted in Charleston, but its shadows are reaching far beyond. Outside, in the distance, a bell rang once in the night, low, deep, and unnatural. None could say where it had come from. But to those who heard it, it felt like a signal. The Kane family's network was expanding. The Ravencroft plantation was no longer a place of whispered dread contained within its boundaries. It had become the heart of something larger, something uncontainable. By the spring of 1823, word had spread across Charleston County that David Kane, once a mere whisper of defiance, was weaving together an intelligence network that stretched from plantation to plantation like invisible vines creeping across the low-country soil. The enslaved had always passed messages in hushed tones, in coded hymns sung at dusk, in carved markings left in the bark of cypress trees. But now those messages had rhythm and coordination. Kane was no longer simply reacting to the master's cruelty. He was building a system, an organization designed to erode the foundations of slavery itself. At first, the signs were small, so subtle the masters dismissed them as coincidence. A plow breaking at the wrong moment. A shipment of tobacco ruined by water damage. A work animal released in the night. But these acts were not mistakes. They were signals, tiny fractures in the machinery of plantation life, spreading wider by the week. Kane never wrote his instructions, never left a map or note that could betray him. His orders traveled by memory, carried in hymns sung with particular inflections, or in Bible passages recited with deliberate pauses. A verse from Exodus might mean a meeting at dusk. A line from Isaiah might mean an escape attempt was coming. By candlelight in a hidden loft, Kane gathered a trusted circle of men and women. "They've built their wealth on our backs," he whispered, voice firm but low. "Every lash they've given, every soul they've sold, let them feel the weight of what they fear most. Let them lose what they think can never be taken." And so the network grew. Not just Ravencroft's enslaved, but men and women on plantations miles away. Kane had spies among field hands, house servants, and even hired free blacks who moved between estates. News of overseer schedules, shipments, and guard rotations traveled faster than the masters could comprehend. The acts of resistance began to escalate. A wagon loaded with cotton mysteriously overturned on the main road, its axle shattered clean in half. A barn filled with drying tobacco went up in flames in the dead of night, the blaze so sudden that even the dogs raised no alarm until it was too late. Plantation owners whispered of curses, of spirits stirred by the Kane family's disappearance, but those who truly listened to the enslaved heard the truth. Kane is moving. The resistance was not wanton destruction. Each act had purpose. Escapes were timed with diversions. While an overseer investigated a fire, 3 souls vanished into the marshlands. While livestock went missing, wagons bound for Charleston left unguarded. Ravencroft's economy, once a jewel of Charleston County, was beginning to bleed slowly, a wound that spread outward to neighboring estates. At plantation gatherings, whispers grew into open fears. Planters would sip brandy with trembling hands as they muttered about strange happenings and troublemakers spreading through the quarters. Cotton ruined at Middleton's. Cattle gone missing at Harrow's. They say someone's leading them, someone clever. A devil in a man's skin. They speak his name like a hymn. Kane. David Kane. What unsettled them most was not the sabotage itself, but the silence that followed it. The enslaved gave no confessions, no trembling apologies under the lash. Their eyes held something different now, an ember of resolve that punishment could not extinguish. The masters realized, perhaps too late, that fear was slipping from their hands. Then came the disappearances. The first was Overseer Briggs, known for the iron buckle he wore to tear skin from backs. One morning his horse returned riderless, saddle torn, reins frayed. They found no body, only a blood-stained buckle hanging from a tree branch deep in the pine woods. Next was Overseer McCree, a man who carried a whip even to church. His cabin door was found ajar, a Bible open on the table, pages blackened as if burned by unseen fire. McCree was never seen again. Whispers swirled through the county. Some said Cain had taken them, others swore the spirits of the Cain family had returned, exacting vengeance from beyond the grave. Whatever the truth, the message was undeniable. Those who wielded the lash were no longer untouchable. By midsummer, Charleston County trembled under a shadow it could not name. Crops spoiled mysteriously in the field. Tools left sharp and whole in the evening turned up shattered by morning. Carriages overturned on roads where no obstacle should have been. The wealthy planters, men who once walked tall with arrogance, now kept pistols under their pillows, fearing footsteps in the night. The enslaved, meanwhile, felt the stirring of something long buried, hope. For the first time, escape did not feel like a dream but like a living possibility. Cain's network had grown so vast, so deeply rooted, that even those who wished to betray it struggled to untangle where it began or ended. One August morning, as the sun burned over the rice fields, smoke was seen rising from the western edge of Ravenscraft. A crop field, nearly half the season's yield, had been set ablaze, fire eating stalk after stalk until only ash remained. But it was not the fire alone that sent a shiver through every master's spine. Staked in the center of the smoldering earth was a crude wooden cross. Hanging from it was an overseer's whip, charred and blackened, tied in the shape of an X. Pinned beneath the whip was a single word, carved into a scrap of timber with a blade so deep it nearly split the wood in half. The planters of Charleston County looked upon it and knew the war they feared had already begun. If you've made it this far into the story, I need you to do two things right now. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this haunting history, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps keep these hidden stories alive. But remember, the fire at Ravenscraft was only the beginning. The fire that gutted the western fields did more than consume crops. It consumed certainty. Ravenscraft Plantation, once the pride of Charleston County, was now a place where ash and silence carried heavier weight than profit or promise. The overseer's whip nailed to the cross remained burned into the memory of every man, woman, and child who saw it. To the enslaved, it was a symbol of reckoning. To the masters, it was a warning they could no longer ignore. Colonel Ravenscraft, who had once strutted through his estate with the confidence of a man born to rule, now paced the grand hall like a prisoner in his own home. The cane he used to steady himself clacked against the wood, echoing with a rhythm of unease. He had ordered patrols doubled, lanterns hung in every corner, and guards posted through the night. But the more he tightened his grip, the more things slipped away. Desperate security measures. He imported dogs, ferocious hounds bred for hunting men, and stationed them near the quarters. He hired armed militiamen from Charleston, promising pay in gold if they could restore order. He forced curfews, forbade gatherings, and even banned the singing of hymns. Yet none of it mattered. The hounds howled at empty fields, their chains rattling in the night, but when morning came, tools were missing, stores of food mysteriously spoiled, and fences found collapsed. The militia rode through the quarters, muskets flashing, yet they uncovered nothing. The enslaved stared at them with hollow eyes, lips sealed tighter than the grave. Ravenscraft began to suspect his own hired men of treachery. Who could be trusted? He asked himself in the dead hours of the night, staring at the candle flame that seemed to mock him with its steady burn. Financial collapse. By summer's end, the plantation's finances had begun to rot. The charred field meant nearly half the cotton harvest was lost. Tobacco barns, sabotaged, yielded barely enough to pay debts owed to Charleston traders. Merchants who once extended credit to the colonel now hesitated. His letters, inked with promises and pleas, were answered with polite refusals or worse, silence. At gatherings, fellow planters kept their distance, murmuring among themselves about Ravenscraft's decline. The great Ravenscraft, they whispered, undone by his own slaves. The colonel's pride was as bruised as his fortune. To him, it was not merely money slipping away, it was reputation, legacy, the very foundation of his family name. A house of fear. Inside the mansion, Unease hung as thick as the smoke that had once rolled across the fields. Mrs. Ravenscraft, once the grand hostess of Charleston soirees, now sat trembling by the parlor windows, clutching her rosary beads until her knuckles whitened. The younger Ravenscraft children, once free to play in the orchards, were confined indoors, forbidden from stepping beyond the gates. They whispered to one another about shadows in the woods and figures glimpsed beyond the fences. At night, they swore they heard footsteps on the gravel paths, though no intruder was ever found. Servants who once bustled with forced cheer now moved like specters. Even in the main house, silence had become suffocating. Isolation. Other planters, terrified of association, began severing ties. Trade dwindled, marriages once proposed between families evaporated. The Ravenscraft name, once carried with reverence, now evoked fear. One evening at a county gathering, the colonel overheard whispers, "Cain's network runs through his land. If Ravenscraft cannot control his slaves, what hope do we have?" That humiliation burned hotter than any fire in the fields. The colonel returned home that night with brandy on his breath and fury in his eyes, striking his cane against the stone steps as he muttered, "They think me weak. They think me undone. I'll show them." The colonel's descent. As days turned to weeks, the colonel's mind frayed. He prowled the halls by lamplight, muttering about betrayal. He no longer trusted his overseers, his hired guards, or even his own kin. Servants swore they heard him speaking to the walls, whispering oaths and curses. At times he claimed to hear voices from the woods, the cries of the Cain family echoing across the swamps. Other times he raged against the silence, striking the hearth with his cane until sparks flew. His obsession with Cain grew into mania. He scrawled the name across ledgers, across maps, across scraps of parchment. "He's here," the colonel rasped one night, "in the marrow of this place. I'll tear him out." The breaking point. The breaking point came on a sweltering September night. The colonel awoke to the tolling of the plantation's bell, a sound meant only to be rung in times of emergency. He stumbled into the courtyard, boots crunching gravel, as servants and guards gathered in confusion. There, at the center of the lawn, stood another cross. This one taller, stronger, its wood freshly cut. Hanging from it was a mask, a grotesque thing crafted from scraps of burlap, stitched with twine into the shape of a twisted face. At its base lay a single musket, the barrel snapped clean in two. No one saw who placed it there. No one dared to speak. But the meaning was clear. Weapons, overseers, the very instruments of control, all were fragile before Cain's hand. The colonel's face drained of color, then flushed with rage. He raised his cane and slammed it into the earth. That night, locked away in his study, the colonel wrote a letter by trembling candlelight. His quill scratched furiously across the page as brandy stained the desk. To whom it was addressed, none could see. But those who glimpsed the draft swore the words "final measure," "blood," and "purge" were written again and again. The colonel sealed the letter with wax, his eyes wild, and whispered into the dark, "If Cain wants war, he shall have it." The winter of 1824 arrived cold and brittle, with winds that cut through Charleston County like a blade. Yet no chill in the air compared to the words that began circulating in January of that year. A confession had surfaced, written, dated, and signed not by rumor, but by the trembling hand of one who had lived in the heart of Cordelia Ravenscraft's twisted program. The document was smuggled northward, though its origin remained clouded. Some swore it had been taken from the colonel's own desk, stolen by a servant who vanished into the marshes. Others whispered it was dictated by one of Cordelia's former assistants, racked with guilt. Whatever the truth, the confession existed, and once set loose, its words traveled farther and faster than any plantation guard could chase. It began with the chilling admission: Cordelia Ravenscraft's so-called program had not been the secret mania of one deranged woman, but an organized system of breeding, mutilation, and experimentation, hidden beneath the veneer of plantation life. According to the confession, Cordelia believed herself to be crafting a stronger stock, not of crops but of people. The confession laid out in detail how she cataloged bodies the way she cataloged her ledgers, noting deformities, bloodlines, temperaments. She did not see human beings but instruments, tools to be sharpened or broken. The words alone would have been enough to turn stomachs. But the confession did not stop there. It revealed collaborators. Names were listed, planters not only in Charleston but in Savannah, Montgomery, and even as far west as Mississippi. The confession alleged that these men had corresponded with Cordelia, trading notes, offering subjects, and sharing results. It spoke of midnight gatherings in secluded barns, where whispers of refinement passed as science. It described letters coded in biblical scripture, hiding grotesque details behind the language of the Psalms. The reaction in the North was immediate. Abolitionists seized upon the document, publishing excerpts in newspapers from Boston to Philadelphia. Sermons thundered with its details. The public was horrified not only at Cordelia's madness, but at the suggestion that she was not alone, that an entire class of Southern planters had participated in her program under the shadow of respectability. The South, by contrast, erupted in fury and fear. Planters denounced the document as forgery, a fabrication designed to inflame Northern sentiment. But their denials carried little weight when whispers in their own circles betrayed unease. Those who had once praised Cordelia's sharp mind and unusual methods now avoided even the mention of her name. And then came the most damning section of the confession, the part that shifted fear from scandal to outright dread. The document revealed how the Kane family had resisted. According to the testimony, the Kanes had not merely endured Cordelia's torment. They had studied it. They had memorized her methods, her codes, her habits. They had mapped the plantation in secret, hidden messages in hymns, and carried knowledge from one generation to the next. The confession described them as a family bound not by blood alone, but by oath, a living ledger, each one a page. One chilling line stood out. "We destroyed Cordelia's books, but the Kanes became the books. We burned her papers, but the Kanes remembered. She made them her subjects, and in so doing she made them her witnesses. Now they carry her program in reverse, knowledge turned into weapon." For the first time, outsiders began to understand why overseers vanished, why barns burned, why Ravenscraft's estate seemed cursed. The Kane family had built something beyond survival. They had built a network, a resistance as disciplined and deliberate as the system that enslaved them. Whispers spread quickly. Were the Kanes in Charleston alone? Or had their methods traveled hand to hand across the South? If they memorized Cordelia's codes, could they now use them to communicate across plantations? Were the sudden fires in Mississippi barns, the unexplained escapes in Georgia, the poison wells in Alabama, all part of one coordinated design? Planters, once untouchable in their power, found themselves sleeping less soundly. Every cough in the quarters, every missing tool, every unseasonal failure of crops took on new meaning. Was it accident or was it Kane? Charleston newspapers, once loyal to Ravenscraft power, began hedging their words. Ministers who had long defended slavery from the pulpit now shifted uneasily, careful not to mention Cordelia's name lest their congregations demand answers. Even some planters' wives, reading the confession in secret, asked their husbands in hushed tones, "Was it true? Was she truly capable of such things?" Meanwhile, in the North, the confession became fuel. Abolitionist speakers held up the document at rallies, calling it the crack in the wall. One fiery preacher in Boston declared, "If the Kane family has risen against their chains, then let the North rise against its silence." But perhaps the most unsettling reaction came not from speeches or print, but from within the quarters themselves. Across plantations, enslaved men and women began to whisper new words in their songs. Kane? For them, the confession was not just proof of horror, it was proof of survival. Proof that knowledge could be turned into power. By the end of January 1824, Southern society stood at a precipice. Planters scrambled to reassure one another, yet suspicion spread like rot. Merchants hesitated to extend credit. Overseers demanded higher pay, fearful of their lives. Rumors swirled that some planters, named in the confession, were quietly preparing to flee their estates before their slaves turned against them. The walls of slavery had not yet cracked, but the sound of splintering echoed faintly in every corner. And then one final line of the confession surfaced, one that had been omitted from the first Northern prints but leaked from the original document. What was once confined to Charleston does not remain so. The Kane family has become legion. What Cordelia began as experiment has become their war. When those words reached Charleston's elite, panic became palpable. If the Kanes were legion, if they were everywhere, then nowhere was safe. Colonel Ravenscraft read the line aloud in his study, his hand trembling as the candle guttered. For a long time he said nothing. Then in a low voice he muttered, "They will come for us all." Outside, the plantation bell tolled once more in the dead of night. Though no hand had pulled its rope, the confession of 1824 has set Charleston and the South on fire, not with flame but with fear. The Kane family's legend is no longer whispered in shadows. It's spreading across states, turning enslaved voices into an underground network of resistance. When the confession spread through northern cities in the winter of 1824, it ignited more than outrage, it ignited purpose. For years, abolitionists had spoken of slavery's cruelty, but their enemies dismissed the tales as exaggerations, sentimentalism, or northern propaganda. Now, in their hands they held something more potent: evidence. The confession bore names, dates, methods, and a cold clinical tone that no sermon or speech could imitate. It was not a moral appeal, it was a record. And it was damning. In Boston, abolitionist societies printed thousands of pamphlets, each carrying passages of Cordelia Ravenscraft's methods alongside testimonies of Northern ministers. Women's groups, long marginalized in public debate, distributed copies in marketplaces and prayer meetings, reading aloud the words that described instruments of torment with surgical detail. In New York, fiery orators recited excerpts in packed halls, demanding that citizens reckon with the fact that American soil was stained not just with bondage, but with experimentation that defied human conscience. The confession became a rallying point. Newspapers drew political cartoons portraying planters as butchers in fine coats, hiding their instruments behind gilded parlor doors. Sermons thundered that the blood of Charleston cries out from the ground. Even in Europe, whispers of the confession traveled with merchants, fueling renewed criticism of the American slave economy. For abolitionists, it was a gift they could not have invented, and they wielded it with relentless force. But while the North thundered with outrage, the South smoldered with fear. The spread of resistance. The enslaved, too, seized upon the confession, not as proof for the outside world but as proof for themselves. Stories of the Kane family had already circulated in whispered songs, in coded prayers, in the silence of night gatherings. But now, with the confession, those whispers found legitimacy. It was no longer a rumor. It was written, documented, undeniable. Across plantations in Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, songs began to carry new lines. Kane remembers. Some spoke of Kane as a family. Others invoked Kane as if it were a spirit, a living force that could not be killed. Overseers overheard chants during corn shuckings, rhythmic words that seemed harmless to the ear but carried dangerous undercurrents of unity. Runaway groups, fleeing into the swamps or toward northern lines, began leaving marks scratched into trees, crosses identical to those found in Cordelia's ledgers. It was as if the Kane family's memory had transformed into a codebook for resistance, spreading further than any single family could have traveled. The impact was undeniable. By late 1824, reports of sabotage multiplied, crops mysteriously failing, fires erupting in barns, overseers vanishing into the night. Some escapes succeeded where before they would have been crushed, aided, it seemed, by an invisible network. The confession had done more than reveal horror, it had revealed strategy. A system destabilized. The planter elite, once untouchable, now found themselves looking over their shoulders. Those named in the confession protested their innocence, but their voices carried little weight. Some fled their estates entirely, liquidating assets before creditors could seize them. Others doubled their brutality, hoping to crush whispers with terror, only to discover that brutality fed the legend of Kane rather than extinguished it. The economic impact was immediate. Merchant houses in Charleston and Savannah saw contracts canceled as northern buyers grew wary of dealing with estates implicated in the scandal. British traders, already cautious after abolitionist agitation in Parliament, quietly reduced orders. Credit dried up, and once wealthy planters suddenly found their ledgers bleeding red. In Montgomery, a planter's wife confided to her sister in a hushed letter, "It is not the loss of money we fear, but the loss of control. Our men no longer sleep, our fields no longer yield, and every shadow now seems to carry Kane's eyes." The plantation system, built on the illusion of permanence, now trembled under the weight of its own corruption. Kane a symbol. What startled both abolitionists and planters alike was the way the Kane family transcended their own story. They had become more than survivors of Cordelia's cruelty. They had become a symbol, almost a myth. To enslaved communities, Kane was not merely a name, it was a banner, a watchword, a reminder that memory could be weaponized. To abolitionists, Kane represented proof that even within bondage, intelligence and resistance thrived. The name appeared scrawled on walls, carved into wooden beams, etched into the bark of trees. In some places, it was said that even children born in bondage were being named Kane, a defiant legacy carried into the next generation. The planters called it contagion, a disease of the mind that spread faster than they could stamp it out. Ministers thundered from pulpits that Satan himself had found a foothold. But for the enslaved, it was hope, hope born not of fantasy but of fact. Panic in Charleston. By spring of 1825, Charleston itself quivered under the weight of rumor. Militia patrols thickened, curfews were enforced, and whispers spread of gallows being prepared for suspected agitators. Newspapers printed editorials condemning the North for inflaming rebellion, even as they avoided mention of Cordelia's name. In taverns, merchants muttered about the collapse of trust. Who else knew? They asked. Who else was part of her circle? Some suggested burning records, others pleaded for secrecy. But secrecy was a failing weapon. The confession had already stripped their world bare. And yet, beneath the surface panic, another rumor stirred, one that gave the elite a different kind of terror. Some claimed that Charleston's archives still held more documents. Cordelia's personal letters, her coded notes, fragments of her destroyed ledgers that had never truly been burned. If those records existed, they were buried deep, guarded by officials who feared that their release would collapse the fragile order of the South entirely. Late one night in a Charleston warehouse, an abolitionist sympathizer claimed to have glimpsed a crate marked not for trade, but for storage. On its lid was a seal, faded but unmistakable, the Ravenscraft crest. When he asked about it, he was told only that the city archives keep things best left unread. The confession had shattered illusions. But the archives whispered of more names, more evidence, more horrors yet uncovered. And somewhere within those locked rooms, perhaps, lay the final piece of the Kane family's story, waiting to be unleashed. The aftermath of the confession shook the South to its core, inspiring resistance and destabilizing entire states. But the whispers of hidden records in Charleston suggest the story is not yet finished. What secrets remain buried, and what will happen if they come to light? The years following the confessions of 1824 were anything but quiet. Though Cordelia Ravenscraft's words had been delivered under pressure, their impact spread far beyond the courtroom and the parish lines of Charleston. The Kane family's name, once whispered only in quarters under torchlight, began to circulate in abolitionist circles from Boston to London. Pamphlets reprinted fragments of testimony, carefully edited to strike at the conscience of readers who had never seen the fields, never smelled the sweat and blood in the Carolina heat. What had once been silenced under the weight of whips and overseers now began to live in print, moving faster than any patrol horse could ride. The Kane family, though never fully accounted for, became a symbol, half legend, half fact. Abolitionist speakers used them as a rallying cry, proof that even within the deepest shackles of bondage, there was strategy, unity, and defiance. Their story suggested not only endurance but organized intelligence. This narrative terrified planters, who prided themselves on claiming the enslaved were docile, incapable of higher planning. The Kane testimony shattered that illusion. In the plantation districts of South Carolina and Georgia, whispers grew into paranoia. Planters doubled their patrols, enforced harsher curfews, and passed new ordinances forbidding gatherings without white supervision. Yet the more restrictions tightened, the more resistance adapted. It was said that enslaved men and women carried coded songs into the night, embedding escape routes and safe rendezvous within their verses. "Follow the Drinking Gourd" was not merely a tune, it was a map. And within those melodies, echoes of the Kane family strategies could be found. Some survivors of the Ravenscraft estate, those not sold off, not beaten into silence, became quiet carriers of knowledge. They were dispersed across counties and states, sometimes intentionally, as planters sought to break up what they called Kane's infection. But scattering only widened the network. Like seeds cast into different furrows, the survivors carried fragments of memory, of tactics, of courage. Over time, these fragments took root in distant places, guiding others toward defiance and escape. Meanwhile, the Ravenscraft estate itself fell into ruin. After Cordelia's trial and the shame brought upon the family, the land was left untended. Cotton fields turned wild with thorn and vine. Overseers abandoned their posts, wages unpaid. The once grand mansion, with its whitewashed columns and looming verandas, stood hollow, windows shattered by storms, the roof sagging under rot. Locals avoided the grounds, muttering that the land was cursed, that the cries of the missing still drifted from the cane brakes at dusk. By the 1830s, travelers on the Charleston Road spoke of strange sights, figures moving in the moonlight near the ruins, though no settlement remained there. Some said they saw a lantern swinging in the distance, bobbing as though carried by an invisible hand. Others swore they heard the rhythmic sound of chains, dragging across the earth long after every slave had been relocated or sold. A preacher, passing through with his congregation, declared the soil itself was crying out against its former masters, for the blood of Abel still speaks. For abolitionists, the ruins became a symbol in another sense. Artists sketched the decayed mansion and printed it in broadsheets, labeling it the house that enslavement built and justice tore down. It was propaganda, but it carried weight. Northern audiences thrilled to the image of a Southern dynasty undone by its own cruelty, its wealth rotting away as surely as the timbers of the Ravenscraft home. And yet, even as the story gained mythic proportion, not all of its threads were neatly tied. Questions lingered. What had truly happened to the Kane family on the night of their disappearance? Were they spirited away by allies in some vast underground movement? Had they been betrayed and buried in unmarked graves, their memory preserved only by rumor? Or had something stranger occurred, something that the surviving documents could not or would not explain? Charleston's archives still held sealed boxes of testimony, restricted to only a handful of officials. Some claimed the documents contained names of prominent planters complicit in schemes darker than the public trials ever revealed. Others whispered that hidden within were personal journals, Cordelia's perhaps or one of her brothers, describing not just resistance but ritual, a mingling of African spiritual traditions and desperate Christian prayer. Such documents, if revealed, might alter the understanding of slavery's resistance forever. But to this day their contents remain uncertain, their pages locked in dusty cabinets under the courthouse vault. The legacy of the Kane family then was twofold. To the oppressed it was a beacon, proof of resistance and the possibility of freedom. To the oppressors, it was a nightmare, evidence that their system was fragile, riddled with cracks. To later generations, it became both legend and cautionary tale, carried in folklore, sermons, and whispered around firesides. And yet, the land itself would not rest. Those who dared approach the Ravenscraft ruins reported more than broken beams and creeping ivy. They spoke of cold air rising from the cellar even in midsummer. They claimed that in the long hall, where Cordelia had once paraded her wealth, shadows moved against the direction of the sun. On certain nights, the air filled with the sound of weeping, too many voices to belong to one throat, too overlapping to be mere wind. Some locals said the house was haunted by the enslaved who had died within its walls, others by the Kane family themselves, eternally bound to the estate they had once sought to flee. One tale described a horseman without a head riding across the abandoned fields at dusk. Another spoke of a woman in white, clutching ledgers and keys, wandering the upper balcony as though still keeping inventory of lives she no longer owned. Whatever the truth, the Ravenscraft estate became a place of dread, avoided by travelers and feared by children. And though the plantation system itself would stagger on for decades, never again would the name Ravenscraft carry pride. It carried only silence, suspicion, and the heavy weight of ghosts. The story of the Kane family had become history and then myth and then something stranger still, a presence. But as researchers in Charleston discovered, not every document had been accounted for. A ledger went missing. A map was torn from its binding. And in the gaps of history, rumors began to grow. Rumors that perhaps the Kane family's fate was not sealed, that perhaps some of them had survived and built new lives under new names. If true, their descendants might yet walk among us, their bloodlines hidden in plain sight. The question remained, was the haunting of Ravenscraft a cry of the dead, or a signal from the living? And in the final archive box, untouched for decades, a letter waited to be read, a letter whose ink had not yet faded, whose words might change the legacy of the Kane family forever. The archivist's trembling hand paused on the broken wax seal, sensing that opening the envelope would unleash more than just history. The archives of Charleston were never meant to feel alive. Their shelves of ledgers and brittle parchment carried the dust of centuries, the silence of courts, the rigid language of bureaucracy. Yet in the winter of 1842, archivist Elias Hammond swore he heard the walls breathe. By then, the Ravenscraft estate had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, a husk of timber and ivy decaying into the earth. The Kane family's story, long suppressed by planters, had leaked into abolitionist tracts and sermons, inspiring networks of resistance across the South. But what Hammond uncovered that year suggested the story was not finished. It began with a sealed envelope at the bottom of an oak box labeled Ravenscraft, miscellaneous. Its wax was cracked, its binding frayed as if time itself had tried to pry it open. The letter was unsigned, its script uneven, hurried, written in a hand that shook with fear. The first lines froze Hammond where he stood. If this paper is read, then I have failed. The Kane family did not vanish. They moved. They burrowed beneath the skin of Charleston itself, and their work continues still. For decades, historians had debated whether the Kane family perished or escaped. This letter offered something far stranger, the suggestion that they had survived and remained hidden, orchestrating resistance not from afar, but from the very heart of the city that sought their destruction. Hammond could not know whether the letter was authentic, but its effect on him was immediate. He felt watched. As he copied the words into his journal, a lantern flickered though no wind touched the room. He swore he saw movement in the corner, a shadow that bent against the direction of the flame. He left that night shaken, and within weeks stories about the Kane legacy began to ripple again through Charleston. Meanwhile, the ruins of the Ravenscraft estate were no longer silent. Travelers spoke of lights drifting through the halls, of voices chanting in languages unfamiliar. A minister who dared to preach on the grounds returned pale, whispering that he had heard children singing hymns in voices layered with hundreds of others, echoing through the rotted beams. Farmers nearby refused to till their soil after one plow-struck bone, not animal but human, the remnants of bodies hastily buried and long forgotten. Some claimed the ground itself would not yield crops, that each spring the earth spat out rusted shackles, nails, or fragments of ledgers. The plantation order, once so secure, now carried cracks across multiple states. The confessions of Cordelia Ravenscraft, amplified by abolitionist presses, spread beyond Charleston's boundaries. Each planter feared another Kane uprising, another orchestrated disappearance, another collapse of their fragile dominion. Paranoia grew into cruelty. Harsher patrols, stricter codes, punishments designed to terrify. But each lash of the whip seemed to birth more resistance, not less. Whispered networks now stretched from Charleston to Savannah, from river deltas to mountain hollows. The Kane name was invoked like a prayer or a warning. Some claimed descendants walked among them, eyes glinting with secret knowledge, carrying the old strategies forward. The line between truth and myth had blurred. In Boston, abolitionist lecturers invoked the Kane family as proof of slavery's inhumanity. They described their brilliance, their courage, their sacrifice. Pamphlets printed woodcuts of the Ravenscraft mansion collapsing under storm clouds, with angels carrying the Kane family upward in triumph. Yet in Charleston, whispers were darker. The Kane family had never left, but had bound themselves to the ruins, a covenant of vengeance that no storm could wash away. One sailor swore he saw them. Passing by the coast at night, he spotted torches along the old estate path, dozens of them, though the land was supposed to be empty. The torches moved in rhythm as if carried in procession, until suddenly, without sound, they vanished all at once. The Kane family was no longer just history. They had become haunting. Elias Hammond returned to the archives again and again, drawn by the letter. Its final lines obsessed him. And so the work remains unfinished. Should their bloodlines persist, so too does the covenant. If Charleston will not confess its sins, then Charleston will burn with them. Was this prophecy? A threat? Or simply the ravings of a desperate hand? Hammond tried to dismiss it, yet each time he crossed the courtyard, he felt the shadows lengthen unnaturally. One evening, he locked the archive doors behind him only to hear a whisper at his shoulder, "It is not finished." When he turned, the hall was empty. Word of Hammond's discovery leaked, though he had tried to suppress it. Soon, clergymen debated whether the Kane family represented divine deliverance or demonic vengeance. Planters denounced Hammond as a liar, a Northern sympathizer. But among the enslaved, the letter carried hope, proof that the Kane family's resistance was not extinguished. The plantation economy staggered under the weight of its own fear. Slaves fled in growing numbers, guided by secret codes and hidden hands. Some said a Kane descendant orchestrated the escapes, moving unseen across state lines, their face unknown but their presence unmistakable. The Ravenscraft ruins became pilgrimage ground. Families stolen from each other would sneak into the estate under moonlight, burying scraps of cloth, whispered names, tokens of remembrance in the earth. They said the land remembered, that it bound their offerings into the greater covenant. By the late 1840s, Charleston was haunted not just by ghosts but by its own unraveling conscience. Then came the fire. In 1852, a blaze tore through the quarter nearest the river docks. Officials blamed accident, yet survivors swore they saw figures guiding the flames, shadows darting between warehouses, feeding the inferno. The air rang with a chorus, not of panic but of song, voices layered upon voices, the same hymns once whispered in the Ravenscraft quarters. The fire destroyed half the district, but no one was ever arrested. Among abolitionists, it was hailed as judgment. Among planters, it was a terror they dared not name aloud. In the ruins, the Kane family's name returned again. But perhaps the most chilling legacy lay not in Charleston streets but in the archives themselves. In 1861, as Union troops approached the city, the records office was evacuated. Boxes were loaded onto carts and sent inland. Yet one cart never arrived. Witnesses claimed it had been seen turning down the old Ravenscraft road, though no driver admitted steering it there. When soldiers searched the ruins, they found no cart, no driver, no documents. Only the faint sound of chains, dragging against stone. To this day, researchers whisper about the missing Ravencraft box. Some say it contained final testimony, maps of resistance networks, names of collaborators across the South, evidence that could have rewritten the nation's understanding of slavery's fall. Others believe it held something darker, not just evidence but ritual, binding ink and blood together into a covenant of vengeance. Whatever the truth, the box has never been recovered. And so the Kane family's story lingers at the edge of history, half buried in archives, half alive in shadow. They are remembered in abolitionist pamphlets, feared in planter diaries, sung of in spirituals that still echo through churches today. But in Charleston, their presence is felt most in silence. In the empty windows of the Ravencraft ruins, in the chill that lingers on the courthouse steps, in the missing box whose trail ends at a cursed estate. Perhaps they were flesh and blood, brilliant strategists who resisted bondage with cunning and courage. Perhaps they became more, spirits bound to a covenant, unwilling to rest until justice was complete. Perhaps they were both, their legacy straddling the divide between history and haunting. The truth is this: the Kane family never fully disappeared. Their story continues to move, to shape, to unsettle. And each time a researcher bends over brittle parchment in Charleston's vaults, each time a traveler wanders too close to the Ravencraft ruins, the silence thickens, the shadows lengthen, and the covenant stirs. For the final line of that letter still waits to be read in full. The final seal is not broken. When it is, the dead will rise and Charleston will answer. If you've stayed with me through the haunting story of the Kane family and the cursed Ravencraft estate, then I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. And if these shadows of history have unsettled you, make sure to subscribe, because the past still has stories to tell and together we'll uncover them.